Probably the most anticipated keyboard release of the past 2 years, Wooting is back today with their new 80HE. This is their answer for people that weren't willing to go down to a 60% layout and didn't want to go full size. Wooting really made a big impact in the gaming keyboard space a couple years back with the 60HE, but Hall effect keyboards with rapid trigger are everywhere now. We'll see if they've managed to stay ahead of all the competition that's popped up over the past few months. Both my boards arrived as separate components that needed to be built, so I've got a PCR ABS plastic build which runs $199.99 US as a pre-built, and that includes the Lecker 60 V2 switches and double-shot PVT caps. The premium version with the zinc alloy case includes the same switches and caps, adds a travel case, and it's going to run $289.99. They've got loads of options too if you want to build your own, including the Gateron Jade switches, which I thought was pretty interesting. They're currently my favorite Hall effect switch. They sound amazing versus basically everything else out there, including the Geon Raptors, and that all comes down to the fact that they're using a closed port on the bottom housing. We'll listen to the difference later. Building these is very straightforward. So we've got our pre-assembled module with screw-in PCB mount stabilizers already installed. These are pre-lubed. This is a PC or polycarbonate plate in white and a white silicone dampening layer under the plate. The gasket mount system is molded directly to this silicone dampener, so you won't be able to remove this layer. Around back is a kind of factory tape mod layer that doubles as ESD protection, but it's also loaded with little facts about various components on the PCB. This is one of those touches that's completely unnecessary, but it's pretty cool if you're nerdy about keyboards. These layers are designed to pass international safety regulations, whereas masking tape from your local hardware store is not. So you can remove this and replace this with the tape mod of your choice if you want to tweak the sound. The Lecker switches have been completely overhauled. These are the V2s. These are no longer made by Gateron, but no official word on the new menu. Looks like a different material on both top and bottom housing. The amount of stem wobble here feels pretty similar to me, the main difference being the sound. The V2s have a smoother, lower tone with none of the high-end sharpness from the V1. These should sound much better when loaded into a board. These also feel really smooth. I don't think there's any reason to hand lube these. I am curious as to why they went with an open port on these versus closed port like we see on the Jades. First case up is the PCR ABS plastic. I got this in what they call frost, so it's a frosted clear. This specific color is not available as a pre-built selection. This is only if you build your own. You can see we've got a daughter board in the upper corner for the USB connection. We also get 3-stage height adjust, which is handled by these large silicone feet that snap into the bottom. Front height on both cases is 19 millimeters. There is some sound dampening foam in here too, as well as a little blocker that prevents light leak around the LED bar. The overall feel of this ABS case is very budget. Feels very similar to the case that KBD fans used for the Tiger LE or some of the entry-level Keychron boards. It's held together with screws, which do have metal sleeves, but there's also a row of 3 clips across the front of the board that I found pretty tricky, and I definitely stressed the plastic in a spot or two trying to get this apart. I would be very careful working with this frame. Wooting's got a video that shows a very specific method of pushing from the inside out to get these to release. It's just really important that you not force anything. It's really easy to crack the front edge of this top case here. Maybe this case feels better, more sturdy in the non-translucent versions, but I definitely wish this felt a little more premium. All in, the board completely assembled in this case weighs only 806 grams or about 1 pound 12 ounces. The zinc alloy case, on the other hand, is very hefty. Comes in a really nice hard shell carry case, handle feels good, zipper pulls all feel real good. The chassis itself feels solid, weighs quite a bit at 1.3 kilos or nearly 3 pounds. There's no extra weight here, either outside or inside this board. It's just the density of the material itself, and unlike some of the all aluminum boards we've seen before, there is absolutely no ping or resonance here at all. The finish on my copy looks and feels really good, and my favorite part is that it just does not fingerprint at all. There's also barely any branding, just a little ghost logo on the top frame that's not even visible when you're using the board. All in all, it's a class look. Great curves, nice lines, no polarizing wrist strap, and no potentially off-putting case designs like we've seen on some of the competing boards. So the layout here isn't a 75%, which is probably the best-selling form factor right now. This is an 80%, and it's basically a slightly restricted version of a TKL or 10 keyless board. It still feels pretty compact on the desk, but you're not sacrificing your F-row or your dedicated arrow keys. There is a fully assignable function layer here, but you'll need to use it far less than you would on like a 60% layout. Now what's not here is any kind of wheel or knob or volume roller that have become increasingly more common, not only on gaming keyboards, but also on customs. The other thing about this layout is that it doesn't have the universal case swap appeal that we saw on the 60HE. At this point, we're limited to whatever Wooting produces. The trade-off is that instead of a tray mount, we've got a gasket mount system here that feels better on bottom mount, but it's still largely a pretty firm typing experience. First impressions on the build, the stabilizers are pretty solid, surprisingly good stock, but the spacebar on my zinc copy did need a little more lube. When I first assembled my white copy, I noticed that there was one section of the LED bar that was dimmer than the others. Initially, I thought this was a QC issue with the PCB itself or a result of these LEDs that make up the light bar not being perfectly aligned. Turns out the problem was with the blocker piece, where one of the sections still had a little leftover silicone from the mold inside one of the holes. Quick bit of surgery and this was all good, but this is something to double check before you build your board if you're buying one of the separate cases. This doesn't affect the pre-built boards because this would be caught by a human QC check. Now, if you're into RGB, it looks really insane on this frosted version. The white caps really set it off too. The black build still pops pretty hard thanks to the white plate and the shine through caps. These are textured, but they don't feel sticky or chalky at all. These are really smooth. All the legends look nice and crisp. Quality wise, these are about as good as it gets for double shot shine through keycaps. This board has a pretty muted, low pitched sound versus something that sounds like it's jammed full of PE foam like the unfortunately named Boog 75. Sound is highly subjective, but I would be willing to bet most people would probably lean more toward that foamy sound. Hall effect boards aren't traditionally known for their great sound, and that's pretty much the case here too. The ABS version is a lot more muted than the zinc. Its alphas are what some people would call dead. This has a lot more character. Here it is with the stock L60 V2 switches versus the Jades with the tape mod, which is personally my favorite config of the bunch. There's not a lot to discuss as far as performance testing because this is just a Wooting in a different form factor, so it feels as nice as you'd expect a Wooting to feel in game. They have added true 8K polling with matched 8K input scanning this time around as well. That probably makes it the lowest latency keyboard out there, but at this point, we're not talking about meaningful or even perceptible differences in latency. Over the past few months, I've spent a considerable amount of time and money working with different engineers on how to measure the true latency between when a key switch actuates and when that information is sent to the USB bus. So not end-to-end full system latency, true latency. What I found is that the difference between Wooting and some of its competitors is so small, you can't even measure it in milliseconds. You have to measure it in microseconds, and in most cases, it's so minuscule, it falls within a margin of error. The biggest factor in keyboard latency is when your switch actuates. So if you're comparing a traditional mechanical switch that actuates at like 2 millimeters versus a Hall effect that you can set to 0.1 or 0.4 millimeters, the mechanical switch board is gonna get blown out every time. But now, with so many competitors using Hall effect, that part of the equation is gone. So you're looking purely at polling and PCB-induced latency, and that is too small to even be a factor. Even the rapid trigger on the clones is getting extremely close, if not imperceptible in most cases. We do have a new version of the Wootility software this time around that's currently in beta with the full stable release slated for sometime in October. I didn't run into any bugs actually using the software, but every once in a while, saving settings to the board, I would have just random keys stop registering correctly. This happened on both PCBs. All I had to do was unplug and replug the board. It is kind of annoying, and it is something that affected both units, so they need to get this sorted before it gets in the hands of customers. I would strongly recommend using the included cable with your board versus a custom cable, as I saw a lot less of this issue when running the stock cable. We of course still have all the features that make a Wooting, so per key actuation setting, dynamic keystroke, rapid trigger, as well as the new modes Rappy, Snappy, and Snappy Tappy, their version of the controversial SOCD feature. I don't know what it is, but saying those names out loud activates something in me on a cellular level that just makes me want to bully people. Not that I would, just that it makes me want to. Snappy Tappy simply prioritizes the last input over the first. So when you're counter strafing and you go right, it instantly cancels out the input to go left. This makes counter strafing much easier. So easy, in fact, that most people considered it cheating, and Valve has now banned it from CS2. Rappy Snappy is a similar concept, but it prioritizes the key that's pressed down further. This, unfortunately, has also been banned in CS2. SOCD has long been available as a script, but Razer and then Wooting were the first to introduce this functionality at a hardware level. In real world, it really only affects games that have very tight movement controls. Like Overwatch 2 benefits a lot, but Call of Duty with its more floaty movement input doesn't really benefit. There's also one of the deepest RGB engines I've seen outside of IQ that allows for a lot of creativity. This profile is actually 3 layers running on on top of each other, and again requires no software running in the background like you'd need for Corsair's iCUE or Razer Synapse. This LED bar can be configured in a ton of different ways too. My personal favorite is the input measurement that shows how much you've depressed a key. Now there's evidently some future plans to include the ability to show system indicators like RAM usage or volume change, but those features will require the use of a lightweight background service, which is not available at the time of this review. Personally, I'm content to run only features that don't require the use of any kind of background service or control software on my machine. It's long been one of my favorite things about the Wooting. So overall, I think aside from the one software firmware bug I noticed and the less than premium ABS case option, Wooting has answered the demands of people who were asking for something closer to a 75%. That's the good news. The bad news is the competition's a lot closer than they used to be, and some of them are able to offer a price point that's tough to compete with. The 80HE is competitive in the ABS pre-built config, but it's firmly the most expensive option out there in the Zinc pre-built config, and that's excluding the numerous 65% options that have popped up. The majority of the clone Hall effect boards are all produced in the same factory and all basically running the same firmware, so when one gets updated, they all get updated, and they have been pretty steady in updating, trying to match both the features and the performance of the Wooting. There are a few things you can normally count on with Wooting. Number one, they're always going to use top quality components, whereas other factories might use lesser components. Two, Wooting will always back up its product if you have an issue. And three, they're always going to continue to innovate, tweak, and refine. It's important to remember that Wooting does one thing, and that's obsess over making high performance keyboards. The question is that enough to get the customer interest over the cheaper clones, particularly the ones that people may feel sound better? Personally, I always try to support companies that I feel are really innovating in their space, but I do understand that not everybody has the budget to do that. I do like this board. The sound may not be for everybody, but if you're gaming, are you really focused on that? I don't really have a lot of objective criticism aside from the ABS case and the lube on the stabs, the space bars specifically. I'm gonna stay using my 60HE like I have since it launched because I really enjoy the form factor, but it'll be really interesting to see how the customer base responds to the execution of this board at this price point. Based on the pre-sales, I think Wooting's gonna be just fine.